devices. Good morning, and welcome to the Medical Devices, Reconceiving Medical Devices panel. I appreciate all of you coming this early, but I think we've put together a program that is going to be worth you having done that. I think medical devices are a very interesting perspective from which we begin to talk about artificial intelligence and artificial intelligence in healthcare specifically. If you think about medical devices, they really cover the gamut of things, many things that are mainstays of therapy and modern medicine. They go all the way from very simple things, like everything from a tongue depressor to a blood pressure cuff, to things that are much more complex. They're by no means simple. Things like imaging devices, MRI devices. These things are all getting, are exceedingly complex with respect to the way they operate and the kinds of reports that they generate and the decisions that they actually drive. And if you go from that level, there's another level of medical device that that is very critical to the way that care is delivered today. For example, a whole class of implantable devices. And some of these devices themselves are not particularly amenable in their use to artificial intelligence, but artificial intelligence plays strongly in the design of those products as well as the manufacturing. Examples here include things like stents, coronary stents, as well as artificial joints and neurostimulation products. And then we progress to devices in which artificial intelligence will not just be used to design them, but it will become part of what defines those as useful devices in the practice of medicine. And these are the kinds of implantable devices that have been used currently in use, things like ICDs, rhythm management devices, pacemakers, and again, neurostimulation kinds of devices. So that when you think about medical devices and artificial intelligence, I think the ability to understand how it fits is related to, in part, what the device does, as well as how it's made, its complexity, and is it implanted, or is it going to be used in some kind of ambulatory capacity? Another thing, or a number of things that play out with respect to artificial intelligence in medical devices are things that look like the use of machine learning, as I said earlier, in the design of devices as well as ultimately their operation. But in many respects, machine learning is used to design a device is very much like machine learning that's used to design a drug. The idea of recognizing patterns, collecting data, statistical learning, then that gets applied through various techniques to identify the patterns that are useful with respect to developing something that drives a medical outcome. But there are some interesting differences when you come to medical devices. If you think about it, if you design a drug using methods of artificial intelligence, and you do the large observational study to collect the data, you detect the patterns, you ultimately deconvolute the data to define novel targets, and then proceed through the drug discovery and drug development process, when you're finished, you have something that looks a lot like a drug that was developed with conventional kinds of methods. One of the things that we will be seeing as medical devices evolve is a slightly different flavor, and that is the class of devices that we are going to be able to use and their performance are things that in and of themselves are learning devices. That is, if we think about the ability to imbue artificial intelligence by its nature into the medical device itself, what it's going to allow us to do is have that device itself learn. Now, learning in its initial instance may be more of collecting the data that ultimately involves, but over time we can see the possibility that such devices themselves can begin to redefine themselves and modify the way they actually work in the condition in which they were designed to treat. I think that in the particular case of where the devices themselves will become intelligent, these will be areas in which you normally think of as implantable devices, but there are classes of devices that, if you think about it, if you think about developing a prosthetic for a below-the-knee amputation, those devices will be intelligent. Exoskeletons for patients who have paralysis, those things will be intelligent. And both classes of devices that are operating in those capacities will be devices which themselves will be capable of learning. I think another trend that's going to play out, that is going to be discussed as we go through the panel, is really the idea that we will move to environments in which the devices themselves are ambulatory in nature. And what I mean by that, when you think about going to a doctor or even at home, episodically you might take your blood pressure. Over time, people who are instrumented with things as simple as a watch, a completely non-invasive and somewhat innocuous device, will be collecting data that's going to inform clinical outcomes or a reflection of a clinical condition or an expected clinical condition in a way that's almost casual, but they will become part and parcel to the way that the devices get developed and part and parcel to the way that they're used within a medical environment. And finally, I think the other thing to think about as we think about how the medical devices will evolve, it's important to break these things down, not literally, but break them down into functional areas. And all of the devices that will become especially interesting in modifying the way that care or health is in fact maintained, care is delivered, consist of some very novel pieces that you often don't see in things like in other areas of healthcare, things like pharmaceuticals, for example, and that will be a new class of very microscopic, perhaps cell-sized sensors that will be detecting the conditions to which the algorithms or the various methods of logic within the device will operate. It'll sense its environment, it'll sense the things it needs to do, and then deliver an action by some appropriate mechanism. So in parallel to what we talk about with respect to the kinds of things that can be achieved, and we'll see quite a bit about those things this morning, in addition to what the device itself does, the ability to sense components, locations within a body that will drive the way the device performs, and what it ultimately does is a parallel development that'll basically change the kinds of things that medicine's going to be able to deliver. Now, to do all of this, we pulled together what amounts to, at least in my opinion, an extremely impressive panel covering more dimensions of the kinds of things that are developed than at least I had a thought or a right to expect when we pulled the panel together. And the panel is really going to focus on three subjects. The first one is, what are some of the major opportunities we see that will be enabled through the adoption of artificial intelligence and medical devices, and what are the difficulties or challenges about actually converting that to reality? The second thing we'll talk about are some examples, both at the technical level and the clinical level, of the types of things that that will be either are available or illustrate the leading edge of what's going to become available. And then finally, I think, given the quality of the panel, the ability to talk about the trends that they see coming, not only with respect to what can be done, but the way that they'll impact the way that healthcare, patients are treated and healthcare is delivered. So with that introduction, what I'd like to do is introduce the panel, starting immediately to my left, and I'm just going to announce them. They will then go on to introduce themselves. Charles Cadieu, who is presently founder and CEO of Bay Labs. Jonathan Rothberg, who is the founder, as many of you know, of multiple life sciences companies, and in particular an incubator called 4 Combinator, and he is currently the founder and chairman of Butterfly Networks. Rick Kuntz is Senior Vice President, Chief Scientific, Clinical and Regulatory Officer at Medtronic, and Jagmeet Singh, who is the Associate Chief of Cardiology at Massachusetts General Hospital and Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. What I'd like to do now is have each one of them introduce themselves and take some time to describe what they do and what they see from their own perspective on the applications of artificial intelligence in the general area of devices. Charles?
Thanks, Pat, for the great introduction and also the privilege to speak on the great panel here. So I can tell a little bit about myself, but a little bit about just about Bay Labs. We're a company that's focused on helping cardiologists and health systems actually extend the reach to monitor, detect, and appropriately time interventions for cardiovascular disease. And we really do that by making an AI that helps anyone to do echocardiography. But a little bit about myself. I'm definitely not from the area of medical devices. I've been working in the area of AI and deep learning for about 15 years, started across the river at MIT. 15 years ago, working on these things that were not called deep learning at that time and way before they were cool. And there's definitely been a lot of hype around deep learning and AI. But there's also been a real kind of reality about the really impressive things that these algorithms have been able to do. And I can share just a little bit of like one light bulb moment that might kind of convey a little bit of that, that transformation that we've all experienced in this field. So back at MIT, we were studying the human visual system and how the primate visual system was able to recognize objects and comparing neurons in the brain to algorithms of the day. And we always held up that the brain and the neurons were just highly performant in terms of how they were able to recognize objects in the world. And we would then test, the algorithms of the day, let's say about, 2010 or so. The neurons were up here and the algorithms were just like down by 0 when we tested on really hard problems. But then we started to work on deep learning and the techniques of that time to really extend, and we started to see these major improvements in terms of the algorithms until they started to rival and then actually surpass what the neurons and the visual system was able to achieve. And so it's not often that you have one of these moments in science where you have to redo your introductory slides about how great the brain is and how bad the algorithms are, but that was one of those light bulb moments. And what it really told us is not just specifically something on this visual recognition task, but something actually more broad, which was that we then believed that anytime there's, you observe essentially someone that has some innate or kind of expert experience where they take some complex data in and they make some rapid judgment or decision based on that data, and you have that data digitized and you have those expert assessments digitized, we think now any of the problems of that type are now solvable with AI and deep learning. And so that really then has created this new paradigm of things that are really kind of locked up in expertise. How can you start to disseminate that to the world through these technologies? And that's really where we got into thinking about Bay Labs and how we can start to solve problems in the space. And as we began to look deeply into healthcare and thinking about how we wanted to move the needle in healthcare, we really started to think about the impact of cardiovascular disease, the impact of missed detections, people that aren't being seen at the appropriate times, the cost of monitoring. How do you make sure you're seeing patients at the right time and then can appropriately treat them with interventions? So really trying to tie intervention to monitoring and detection. And we then kind of unraveled this at the next level and took those learnings from the deep learning side and which of these problems are now solvable, which hadn't been solvable before. And we saw this big opportunity within echocardiography, where this is a skill that's contained in sonographers. So it's a profession that we've created to hold an ultrasound probe and attain high quality imagery for echocardiogram, and also expert cardiologist readers. And we then, using deep learning, took those skills and then helped machines to attain those similar skills. And so to people that are not familiar with handheld ultrasound, it's a difficult task, and I often describe it as trying to cut your own hair in a funhouse mirror. And so it has this, you could probably get a hang of it if you did that every day, but it is not intuitive. And that's essentially what sonographers and expert, echocardiographers have done in terms of achieving that ability. And that's what we've been able to do in machines. So we've now since been able to capture that ability of acquiring imagery, which we can then give to any medical professional to get to high quality imagery. And we've also taken the ability of expert cardiologists and actually now shown that our algorithms are as performant as cardiologists in interpreting left ventricular ejection fraction, for example, and other cardiology important values and interpretations in the data. So really what I think is exciting is sort of the paradigm shift that this can create, where no longer do you have to only go to the can you only go to the echo lab to get these types of measurements and monitoring, but you can start to think about how this is disseminated through the system and how health systems can start to solve those problems that they're facing. How do they find disease in their populace at a lower cost? How do they monitor disease progression? And how do patients then get the appropriate treatments at the appropriate time? We think we can then give this technology and this ability to other types of medical professionals that typically have not had that ability. And I think Pat asked us also to talk a little bit about how we see the progression of AI in the devices.
We're going to come back then.
Okay,
okay, good.
Great. I'll talk about that in both.
Exactly.
Thanks, Pat.
Thanks. Yeah. Jonathan?
Yeah.
I'm Jonathan Rothberg. I'm the founder of Butterfly Network. Everything I do is motivated by people I love. I started the field known as next-gen or high-throughput sequencing because when my son was born, he was rushed to the newborn intensive care unit, was having difficulty breathing, and I wanted to know what was wrong. To accomplish that, we moved DNA sequencing to a chip, to a semiconductor device. And taking that paradigm, we were able to reduce the cost of DNA sequencing a millionfold over the last 18 years. When I started, it cost over $1 billion to do a genome. You can now do a genome on a chip for $1,000. It was an exciting journey, and I learned a lot about the intersection of computer science and medicine. My daughter has growths in her kidney. We would drive up to Boston and see Elizabeth Thiel, who's in the audience today, every 6 months or a year to monitor it. And after my success in DNA sequencing at 454 and then Ion Torrent, I realized there was an opportunity to change imaging. And this time, we didn't have to improve it a millionfold. We didn't have to go from $1 billion process to a $1,000 process. We only had to improve it 100-fold. But I took the same approach. I put together the smartest team I could find on the planet, came to MIT, asked Mac Tegmark, who's a physicist there, who's the smartest student at MIT. He gave me Nevada Sanchez. And I put a bunch of people that didn't know better, and I said, you guys are going to put an entire ultrasound machine on a chip. Now, I knew if we reduced the cost of ultrasound 100-fold, it still wouldn't help. You still have to know how to acquire images, and that takes an expert. And you still have to know how to analyze images. And historically, that took an expert. But the motivation was there. Besides my daughter, every day, every 90 seconds, a woman dies in childbirth. That could be prevented if you had ultrasound. 2,400 children die a day from pneumonia. Half of that is preventable with ultrasound and antibiotics. So we put together a team, and we put ultrasound on a chip, put together a team, and we added AI to do both the acquisition assistance and the analysis. Now, I want to make it clear this isn't a story about what's coming in the future. Last week, I saw on Twitter somebody with our Butterfly IQ unit in a Kenya hospital scanning patients for the first time. 99% of the world has no access on a regular basis to medical imaging. That same week, I saw on Twitter 9 physicians running around NYU with that device. But I want to show you, though, that we haven't just put it on a chip and made it cost under $2,000 and shipped it to Kenya and NYU. We've made it so anybody can use it. And I thought there was no better way to prove it than take a student from Harvard Business School and see if he can do a cardiac exam. To date, we've taught our AI a few applications. We've trained it to look at the heart and do heart health. But before you can do your heart health, you have to acquire the right image. So using augmented reality in a split screen, hard to see here because we can't zoom in, but you can go onto the web, Darius can guide that probe to collect the right image. Once he's collected the right image, Darius can not only look at his heart, but he can do the ejection fraction. Now, I did it a while ago, actually in December, on my boat with my son, who was 18 years old, and he did his cousin, who's also 18 years old, and they did the ejection fraction of each other. And then I was told they could have billed $1,000 for that if they were at Partners. Yeah. So Darius has no training in this. Now, we've trained this to do two things so far. We've trained it to do cardiac ejection fraction from a number of angles, if you will. But we've also trained it to understand aortic aneurysms. And this year, we'll be sending it home with patients, hopefully with some partners on the stage here. And they'll be monitoring people for aortic aneurysms, screening them, and getting them, hopefully, a Medtronic device before they die. So instead of having a 90% chance of dying when their aorta bursts, they have a 99% chance of living by catching it. So this is a clear example where you can take this revolution in semiconductors. $3 trillion went into that semiconductor supply chain. Put an entire ultrasound machine on a chip. Now we mass produce it in a way that we can sell it for $2,000 and combine it with the amazing work that's been done at NVIDIA, Google, and others in artificial intelligence to literally allow anybody, thanks Darius, Harvard Business School, to collect data and analyze it. Now, all of you know there's a lot more to do than just do aortic aneurysms or cardiac ejection. There's this long tail of applications. The beautiful thing about AI, and why this is really different from the last 30 years of people crying wolf, is it's real. Most of us who are in the scientific community know it's real because Google and DeepMind trained a system to play Go, and then they used that exact same software, just gave it the rules of chess, and it became a master chess player. This is different than anything before. In our case, we took that same software that was developed, that TensorFlow, we trained it to do hearts, we trained it to understand aortic aneurysms, and now, along with our device, along with that AI to help you acquire and analyze, we have telesonography. So I mentioned our device is in Kenya. I mentioned our device is at NYU. Our computers are watching that device. They're watching experts acquire images. They're watching experts analyze and annotate images. Now that same software that we trained for 2 applications is learning that long tail of applications by all of you using it. And that's why this is different than anything before. So we're at a cusp of a revolution. I think it's going to be as big as the genetic revolution. When we started gene sequencing, we did our first precision medicine over 10 years ago at Harvard. And it took the FDA 10 years to approve sequencing for diagnostics. We were told we'd have difficulty getting our device approved because all precedents use piezoelectric crystals, and here we had micro machines right on a semiconductor. It turns out the world has changed. It didn't take us 10 years. We not only got approval for our device, we got the broadest approval in the history of ultrasound for our device. We are now cleared for over 14 applications. There's virtually nothing you can do except stick it inside your body with our probe that's not FDA approved. So it's not only that the world has changed with semiconductors and artificial intelligence, It's that the regulatory environment has changed. The FDA gave us the broadest approval. And this month, the FDA went further. They approved an algorithm, not to support a diagnostic, but to make a diagnosis for the first time. So we have a perfect environment. The world for 20 years has known they need a window into the body. It's been 200 years since the stethoscope was invented. It's been 100 years of doctors seeing patients and only referring them to imaging. And now it's time to invert that and make part of a regular medical exam, not only percussing, but looking inside the human body. We're just getting started. The images you saw look like ultrasound, but we have no bandwidth limitations. In the next 2 years, this will be a full 3D live window into the human body. And as I mentioned, our AI is learning right now from Africa to New York how to do that long tail of applications. So it is an amazing time for AI, and it's not crying wolf. It works this time.
Thank you. Rick?
Now I'm realizing the consequences of sitting in chair 4. It's a hard act to follow. My name is Rick Kuntz. I was a cardiologist at the Brigham and Women's Hospital about 12 years ago. And my academic interest was mainly in clinical trial methodology and biostatistics. I joined the company, again, 12 years ago. I ran the neuromodulation business, which was an interesting switch from cardiology for 4 or 5 years. And then I became kind of overseeing the scientific operations of the company. So Medtronic is the largest medical technology company in the world and mainly focused on therapeutics. But in the last 5 to 10 years, we've really moved to more of the sensing side. So almost all of our implantable devices have some sophisticated sensing capability. And we utilize that capability to modulate therapy. Now, I'll give you some examples. For example, deep brain stimulation is used to treat advanced Parkinson's disease. The target is the subthalamic nucleus. And the normal therapy is a tonic 50 to 100 hertz signal with a low amperage and voltage of about 1 to 2 volts. We have now developed a sensing system in the deep brain stimulation that basically senses the sinusoidal wave activity in the frequency spectrum using a kind of a spectral analysis approach to modulate the signal. To turn it down at night, to wake people up in the morning by opening their eyes. And this is becoming more and more of a learning machine that customizes for each patient. We have a variety of different algorithms in our ICDs and cardiac resynchronization devices that will overdrive pace pre-arrhythmic catastrophes like ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation that learns from each patient a pattern of the natural history of those disorders and arrhythmias. We have and I'll talk about this probably in more detail, a closed loop system for insulin delivery that basically keeps people in the zone by altering insulin based on unique patterns of hyper and hypoglycemia detected by a continuous glucose monitor. So we're getting some still relatively crude information. Most of the algorithms are kind of classic PID algorithms, some of which have some learning capabilities. But the real goal of the company is to really incorporate more and more sensors into a learning system. So for example, we have a device mainly intended to record EKGs called the Link device that can be inserted above the breastbone, a small device about the size of a vitamin pill. But it has an accelerometer. It has a tissue impedance capability to be able to look at applications like right heart failure. We use impedance to look at left heart failure from the leads and pacemakers to the can inserted in the upper shoulder that looks at water density across the lungs. These are now being incorporated into multiple different sensing devices, such as using this Link device with a continuous glucose monitor to potentially detect early diabetic ketoacidosis by looking at activities, respiratory rates, and so on. So I think what we're looking to develop is more informed therapy delivery of our classic therapy devices by incorporating more and more sensing capabilities, implantable sensors, as we've heard about, but to have some kind of intensive processing system that would coordinate all these sensors for either 1 or 2 different therapies being used, whether it's, again, neuromodulation devices, cardiac devices, and potentially other devices such as diabetes control.
Thanks. Jag?
Thanks, Pat. So in my professional opinion, I think Darius has a normal ejection fraction, and that'll be $500. So I will admit that I'm probably the least qualified to be on this panel. And over the next few minutes, I'll try to sound as intelligent as possible, even though it may sound artificial. You know, I am a cardiac electrophysiologist by trade, so I spend a lot of my time implanting devices. These devices are, they could be pacemakers, they could be resynchronization therapy devices, they could be defibrillators or implantable loop recorders. And in addition to that, I use devices for treating rhythm disturbances. That is, we go in and burn circuits and take care of ventricular tachycardia, atrial fibrillation, and the like. Now, having said that, these implantable devices already work within the framework of narrow artificial intelligence, as Rick alluded to. They're intelligent enough to intervene with the use of simple algorithms. Now, over and above that, they have many sensors. They have sensors which can measure heart rate. They have sensors that can measure physical activity, respiration, thoracic impedance. But it's still at its infancy right now. Although these sensor strategies used either independently or collectively may predict heart failure hospitalization in some of these patients, they're not being used at the highest level they potentially could be used. And I think a part of that is that they're not integrated with the electronic health record, and there are no AI strategies for actually distilling that information and setting forth interventions that can automatically translate into better care. So I'm really excited about that potential interfacing of AI with electronic health records and sensor strategies. The next thing is the non-implantables, the wearable sensors that coexist out here. How will these interface with implantable devices and then integrate with electronic health records, where AI, again, will play a role in helping us better manage these patients? So those areas, I think, are really very interesting. The second area of interest that I have is in treating arrhythmias. And you know, we spend a lot of hours trying to take care of atrial fibrillation or ventricular tachycardia ablations. We can spend several hours trying to target a circuit. But if you had large training data sets with appropriate artificial intelligence strategies, you could actually, I would say, abbreviate the whole procedure and target it more selectively. So I'm really excited about the potential for AI in this space too. And I think a lot of this is going to potentially involve collaboration between the academia, between different centers, with the industry. And with that said, I'm hoping that this conversation today will help illustrate how that can be done.
Yeah, one of the things that interested me when Jonathan went through his demonstration, this is a question for Rick and for Jag as clinical trialists, is that he illustrated the challenge better than we could do in words that's going to happen, and that is the sequential development of more and more applications off of a common platform. The time to which you implement is actually gotten or will in fact be relatively short, or hopefully it'll be relatively short. The question is, how are you going to validate this? What about the clinical validation of this with respect to not just what passes the FDA, but what works for you as a functioning clinician?
Well, I'll give you an example with our so-called artificial pancreas. We have a closed-loop insulin system, which I referred to earlier. It's not really an official artificial pancreas because pancreas also does glucagon, so this just does insulin, but it's good enough. The first validation required a long process. First, we had to use an in-house process where we brought people to hotels and wanted to watch them very carefully as they use these algorithms. So you're taking patients that have brittle diabetes, having total control by a separate wearable machine. You've got to really watch them carefully to make sure the algorithms work. So there was kind of parallel testing, finger sticks, and so on, in addition to the algorithms moving on, just to make sure that they were fine. A lot of these were kids. They were in hotels with endocrinologists in the hotel. That process was phase one. Then we did a randomized controlled clinical trial looking at a variety of outcomes, including in-zone glucose, how often does it stay between 80 and say 160 or 140 as a percent of time, what's the hemoglobin A1C, and compared that to multiple daily injections with finger sticks versus the artificial pancreas versus just a regular insulin system, 3 different arms. And we showed superiority with the artificial closed loop system. That was about a 1.5-year clinical trial, published in the England Journal of Medicine, kind of a breakthrough therapy. Now, as we increase our algorithms and improve them, we are looking at post-market studies in real time. And so this requires a little bit of Bayesian statistics to look at ways to, at iterations. You can't possibly generate a new hypothesis and test it in a prospective randomized trial every time something goes on, but you can leverage things like informative priors and updating likelihoods that you can fine-tune using a variety of Bayesian techniques. And these are things I think the FDA is really working hard with us to understand in order to make things approve faster. So the validation will converge to something that is likely more of an update of existing posterior distribution rather than a simple chi-square t-test looking for a validation of a hypothesis.
If I could add to that, that was fantastic. I think there are different levels of validation also that would be important. And it depends on how smart the artificial intelligence algorithm is. Depending on what the effector arm is, so let's presume you have a device that serves to alert the physician who then makes the intervention. So the device has the appropriate artificial intelligence. It detects there's a problem. It informs the physician. That's level 1. The second level is when you upgrade the smarts, it actually informs the patient, and the patient, him or herself, can intervene in that particular area of whatever the disease subset is. And the third level is where the device is smart enough that it intervenes on itself. And I think we can leapfrog to having closed-loop systems, but I think in the long run, that's exactly what we want. But I think it's not a bad thing to also have a staged process where it gets validated, because there are a lot of complexities when you start integrating the different covariates, the different comorbidities, and there are different responses and interactions that can take place. So I think validation depends eventually on what the effector arm for that AI algorithm is going to be.
Jonathan, another question for you. I mean, one of the things, and Rick really underscored this in a material way. One of the things that'll drive the real innovation and the real movement to novel therapies and novel maintenance programs is really the development of sensors. You obviously developed one that is not only functional, but functional at a very high level, meaning it doesn't require an expert. What do you see the challenge of doing the kind of sensor development that can deliver the capability to medicine that AI is capable of?
That's a great question. It turns out that it is a big problem. What do I mean by that? When we wanted to put an ultrasound on a chip, we couldn't raise $1 million to do it. We had to raise $100 million to do it. Because you had to not only make a semiconductor device that was going against that 50-year precedent, one that would do any frequency, so you could do your carotid artery as well as your heart, but we also had to have a team of computer scientists, and we had to have a medical team. Our chief medical officer, actually, while he was validating our technology, became patient 1. Because while he was comparing it for the FDA to a $60,000 machine so we could get approval, he found a cancer on himself and quickly went to treatment. And because he caught it early, was able to avoid chemotherapy. But it's a bigger problem. It wasn't a software only. It was hardware, it was software, it was medical, it was regulatory. And it's a long process. We spent $100 million in 5 years doing it. And I can tell you there was at least one coup about a year ago when the whole world said a micro machine will never have the pressure to do cardiac. You might be able to check a bladder, you might be able to do carotid artery, but you can never get the pressure. And my team said, let's pivot the company, let's do ultrasound processing units, let's keep the piezo crystals. And I had to say no. I had lost the company once, so this time I had 10x voting, so I didn't lose it. But the point is, these are tough things. Making a new sensor, going, as Peter Thiel says, from 0 to 1, is a big problem. And you have to also have financiers that don't say, hey, when it doesn't work in 4 years, we quit.
Yeah.
So these are bigger problems than we faced before because they span doctors to computer scientists to engineers.
One of the other things in listening to the way that Jag described how these things get adopted, and the idea that you have to not just have local capability with respect to the device as it's implanted or as it's used on a patient, but the need to network these things. There's a study that was issued recently that asked in medical devices or in medicine generally, what areas are the most dominant ones in which AI is going to have an impact? And the study came back to say management of chronic disease, medical imaging, no surprise with what we've seen, and medical applications of the Internet of Things, very close to what I think I heard Jag say. Charles, what do you see as the ability to move through that spectrum to be able to network pieces to existing devices and the devices that are yet going to be emerging? Is it an issue of standards or is it something else?
It's a great question, and I think the way I'd almost sort of pivot the question a bit is to try to understand where the needs are, and I think that it's important to remind ourselves that devices and AI, for all their promise, are really just technologies, and we really need to think more about the problems that they're satisfying. And so I think that the spectrum of things that you just mentioned, in terms of chronic disease management, that's an obvious thing that that healthcare needs help with. Medical imaging is essentially a technology, but you have to really think more about where the problems are in this ecosystem that we've created that is doing medical imaging every day at quite proficiency. How do we kind of think about the democratization that AI allows? And maybe I'll just share a little bit about how electricity actually kind of changed manufacturing. I think it's kind of an interesting thing from the steam age to the electrical age. And it wasn't immediately obvious how this was going to happen. It took about 50 years, first of all, which is kind of shocking to think about in today's fast-paced change. What they then found, though, is that they didn't just look at manufacturing and then take out the steam engine and then put in an electrical generator, and then all of a sudden they had a benefit. All the infrastructure was already set up to do those manufacturing processes with steam. There was no really added benefit. And it took a lot of time to find those opportunities of changing the assembly line, enabling each manufacturer as an individual to have different types of tasks they're doing. These are the types of things they need to discover and explore. So I think it's different to say that we don't just want to take each medical device out there and then replace it with an AI medical device. I think that's actually the wrong way to go about this. I think you really want to think about the problems that healthcare is faced with, and think about healthcare at lower cost, thinking about how do health systems that are expanding, how do they ensure quality across their entire ecosystem from every corner of their health system. And I think that those are really the types of thinking where you pair AI with medical devices to really try to solve those problems that health systems are facing, not to just cookie cutter replace every device with AI, but to think about how you can kind of democratize knowledge and kind of push those problem boundaries. And that's where we'll really have successes, but it will be challenging to find those things.
We have about 6 minutes left, and so what I'd like to do is to take the remainder of the time and start with Jag on the other side of the podium and talk about the proverbial tech question of what comes after, what comes next. Where is this going?
So can I take all 6 minutes?
Go ahead.
So, I think I highlighted in my introduction, I think what comes next is actually for all of us to recognize the importance of where AI is and how it can actually be a part of everyday clinical practice in the future. I think from where I look at from my vantage point, I think having really exquisite training data sets to create the right kind of algorithms is going to be really key. I like what Charles said is we need to kind of have a balcony vision and not create the sensor and then try to find a use for it, but actually know what we really need to do in the big scheme of things whether it's processes where AI can be used, or whether it's in diagnoses, whether it's preventative strategies, but it allows us to be proactive and preventative, and I think that's the overarching theme. So I think what comes next is for the academia and the industry to kind of come together and generate a strategy of generating these training data sets so we can start creating the right algorithms for different disease subsets.
Rick?
I'll give you the practical, then a kind of a wild ambition. The practical is to start to harness existing clinical practice databases with our sensors to be able to develop a learning healthcare system. So this is the kind of goal of the National Academy of Medicine for many years, and we have a data science group in my group that is focusing on learning how to procure meaningful information from clinical practice databases at hospitals, which is really, really hard. And then to combine that with data from machines, machine data, into a unique database that actually can serve patients to develop the learning healthcare system, meaning that we can, in almost near real time, understand what the next step is for taking care of patients. That's practical, and that will happen. It's just a matter of finally trying to get some kind of harmonization in the disparate electronic health record systems. The wild ambition is to really develop the digital twin. And when I talk about the digital twin, I'm talking about what they do with Rolls-Royce for jet engines. If we have a property, a collection of correct sensors in the body for certain conditions that can be processed in near real time and be able to predict heart failure, be able to predict exacerbations of chronic diseases early on in near real time, that would be the total digital twin goal. And I think that's possible, but it's going to take a few things to line up correctly.
Jonathan?
I separate everything we do into something I call the short loop and the long loop. Everything I showed today was the short loop. So when Darius measured his heart, if a cardiologist looks at it, he corrects how the machine drew ejection fraction and it gets better. If you're looking at it, aorta, an expert can correct the machine. We're working with Gates to do fetal health and stage a baby. UNICEF wants to understand pneumonia and catch it early and treat it. In each of those cases, you use the device, you take an image. If you're not an expert, you take the advice back. If you're an expert, you correct it. That's a short loop. Everything I talked about, everything we're doing realistically in the next 2 years is that short loop. However, as we're working on this short loop, both Google and Apple are starting to think about health and starting to think about those health records. And they do have plans that 2 years from now, the majority of people that are sophisticated, especially those in this room, will be able to download your medical records to your phone. I think if you try to do something too early, it's one of the reasons companies fail. However, 2 years from now, with those medical records, instead of just doing fetal aging, as Gates wants to do with our probe, we can go into those medical records and start learning in that long loop. You have outcomes. A good sonographer may be able to say whether someone has Down syndrome with a 70% confidence. These machines will get to 99% confidence because they'll have that long loop and those outcomes. Not only will they have the long loop and the outcomes with that imaging, but as both of you mentioned, there's other information, whether it's your genetic information, any of your implantable devices, that can also be integrated. So I see the next 2 years mostly about the short loop, getting these devices out there, working within the device and the data it creates, correcting it, validating it, getting a long tail of applications that are great. But I do see 2 to 10 years going into those medical records that are on your Android or Apple phone and really making these machines smart. And they really can be superhuman. When our chief medical officer looked at his growth in his neck, he looked at it in more dimensions than a human can. You can do elastography. You can watch a cancer metastasizing. It can learn that. And so I see this long loop really changing medicine.
Charles, you get the last word.
Great. So if I extend a little bit on that, that theme there and think then more about the care pathway and how patients are then flowing through towards treatments. And I think this sort of sense of a pervasive monitoring network of patients looking at structural heart disease, in its earliest stages? How do we, at a low cost, monitor that disease progression? How do we then get alerts to doctors to tell them that these are the patients you need to see today, and we're going to expect certain outcomes in the near future. We need to have a care plan developed from there. How does an AI help the scaling of each of those little decisions there? How do then interventions actually then affected by AI? How do we have implantables and transcatheter structural heart procedures that are guided by AIs that through a clinical trial, a global network of an AI can see all of those operating rooms and see the procedures, and within a couple patients have expert ability that they can then feed back to interventional cardiologists. Then how do we have then devices that are implanted that then have continuous monitoring with AI guidance to alert doctors that this patient now 20 years post operation is going to need another chance, another look.
Well, with that, we've run the course of the panel, and I'd like to thank the panel for both a very informative, but more than that, an engaging and an exciting picture of where this world is going. Thanks very much.